Okay, so everyone, we are recording, and this is call it a family and friends information session for Mark. Do you want to be referred to as Mark Patience?
Mark's fine. I put the Mark Patience with Ryder in brackets there for. I'll get into that a little bit as we go along.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Katherine Coder. I've been working with Mark for several years, but I've known Mark for 6 or 7 years at this point. We met through a meditation group that I used to host in Miami Beach, which went on for a couple of years, I think, Mark.
Yeah.
So
a couple of your workshops.
Yes, definitely.
And then we started doing actual therapy together, and
Yes, and I've always played I would say an adjunct role to some degree in Mark's therapeutic continuum, and been more on the spiritual end of things, the more transpersonal end of things, and worked with Mark in a kind of an alternative healing capacity. So I would say Mark and I are friends also at this point. So that's a little bit about me. I'm happy to answer any other questions anyone has for me. I have a doctorate in transpersonal psychology and working on getting a licensed professional counselor license here in Colorado now that I live in Colorado. So I've been seeing clients for about 10 years overall. And I'm happy to be here supporting this call for everybody. And hopefully through this experience together tonight, we'll all come to a greater degree of clarity about what's been unfolding for Mark, and have some questions, whatever questions you all have those questions answered, and create a family, friends environment for Mark that's more supportive in the sense that you all know a bit more about what he's going through and his new reality. So that's in a way an intention for our time together tonight. Mark, do you want to say anything else?
Yeah, that's a great introduction, Kat. I think one thing to make clear for you guys is Kat works with a lot of different people with a lot of different kinds of trauma. She's really gifted, sort of a holistic practitioner. So there are kind of like, clinical levels, psychologists and psychiatrists and everything. She's in there, but she just doesn't have those clinical credentials. But as far as I'm concerned, she's every bit as competent as people who have more scientific backgrounds. Her background is to look at the whole sort of milieu of people and where they're at, and a lot of that does involve the spiritual. So while she isn't here kind of like representing any kind of expert in DID, she's seen a lot of dissociations. She understands a lot about, how we layer our awareness. And so there's a really great resource for me. I've been very, very fortunate to have her in my life, helping me out with things for the years that we've been together. So just to make it clear that you're not trying to have expert questions shot at you, Kat.
Yes, my training is in clinical psychology, and I've been working through about 3 years of trauma therapy training as well, and I have a basis in attachment theory. So it's very important to understand the early landscape of someone's life in order to understand how trauma unfolds, and then what kind of effects that can have later on. So that's a bit of thank you, Mark, for filling in some of those gaps and details about my background. And yes, how did you see us moving forward at this point, Mark? Do you want to open questions? Do you want me to say a little bit more?
Well, I thought what we could do is maybe just let people ask a couple of questions to get started.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping Dave folds in here soon.
Mm-hmm.
Hilary is, I just texted her and she says she's having problems doing video. So she's probably just listening in. I don't know if she's going to speak up at some point, but
Welcome to.
Yeah, you just chime in whenever. But yeah, I don't really have a format involved. I can do a little bit of a rambling talk when Dave comes on to just kind of outline what my last year and a half has been like.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody here on the call knows that I've been diagnosed as bipolar for about 20 years.
Okay, good.
I've done a lot of, I would say, attachment work, looking at my adoption. Dave, I spoke with him last night briefly, and he wasn't aware, and maybe a few of you aren't, that I was not adopted right away as a baby. I was given up by my birth mother, Hilary's mom, Andrea, in the hospital, and she thought I was going to be adopted out within a day or two. So what wound up happening was I had a really, really big head. And so in the hospital, they decided to hold on to me for observation for a while. And I've gotten a lot of this from the adoption notes, but my head was kind of, I guess, dangerously big there in the beginning. So I was in the hospital for a while. It looks like maybe, to me, it's hard to tell, but maybe a couple of months. And so I was on my own. I guess things evened out a little bit, and they put me in medical foster care. Now, at that point in medical foster care, I'd sort of formed an attachment to these medical foster care people, and that lasted for 4 or 5 months. And then when I was at 6 months of age, they figured out that no, his head isn't so big that we have to put a shunt in, and that we can actually just have him adopted out in a regular adoption, a non-medical adoption. So at that point, I was lucky enough at 8 months, my parents came along and I was adopted into a great family. But in those early months of limited or no attachment or changing attachment regularly, it was pretty rough. And so the way I describe myself to people in a quick blurb is to say I'm kind of like one of those Romanian babies, but not quite the brutal orphanage picture, just kind of like a half Romanian orphanage baby that probably had a lot of neglect and a lot of unmet needs in the beginning. So
probably harder because you were an ugly baby.
What's that?
It was probably tough because you were an ugly baby too. They really ignored you.
My brother was an ugly baby with a very large head, so people.
No, but I could relate though. Like it's possible that they just kept you alive, right? They'd give you a bottle, change you once a day, and never held you in, or like I could see it would affect the person.
Yeah.
Well, you were neglected at that age, right?
Yeah. Well, having the nursing background has been interesting in a couple of respects because, I know enough. I've worked a little bit in nurseries, and I know enough about when you're busy on shift and you've got 6 or 8 babies. You generally just pick them up to feed them. That's the only time they get picked up.
Yeah.
So that kind of like tension in your nervous system, feeling like you're abandoned constantly, is wears on you. And I can feel that trauma in my body sometimes. I can feel that tension of not being safe. So it's a weird thing. And I've only in the last, say, 7 or 8 years really been able to put my finger on some of this stuff. But that constant, I've talked to Kat about it over the years. There's like a trap door that just opens up underneath me, and I'm totally hollow for sometimes days at a time. But sometimes it's just 20 minutes or an hour. But I've always got this kind of gnawing feeling of being vulnerable and alone, very quickly. So,
well, and we know that now babies gestate outside of the womb for 12 months. So, unlike every other mammal on the planet, humans it would be physically impossible to birth a human at their developmental capacity that other mammals are birthed at. So if you see, for instance, like a foal being born, within like a handful of minutes, the foal is birthed, and then gets up and walks. Whereas if you look at a human babies are not walking for months and months. I mean, my son walked at 11 months and he was early. So humans, because of the size of our heads, not just Mark, your head, but all of our heads, none of us are going to go through the birth canal at the size that we would be at 12 months, for instance. And so we know now that humans go through about a year-long process of exogestation. And so they are born, but they are totally incapable of doing most things that mammals do when they're born. And so they do need to be held almost constantly, to be attended to frequently, to be looking into a caregiver's eyes. There's a lot of communication that goes on just through the eyes. And so, we know that babies, for instance, have very limited vision. They mostly cannot see anything after they're born, but they are able to see from basically their eye level to a caregiver's face that's holding them. So that's about how far they can see. And so when a baby is born, that's pretty much all they see or can see is this caregiver looking at them. And so they become highly attuned to faces, eyes, movements of the face, and all of that. And that's like essentially their lifeline. And a lot of their brain development is happening because of this eye to eye gazing that's going on. And their primary needs are basically warmth and, human touch. And, they need, to be hearing the human voice, the prosody of the human voice, oh, look at you, they're really developing through these kinds of things that we just automatically, the way we speak to babies, the way we hold babies, the way we touch babies, and then through feeding. And, this is their world, essentially, is that. And there's a lot of very important brain development that goes on through that kind of relating. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that people have always known before us. Like more ancient people knew these things, but we have to have science tell us this is actually true for there to be changes in hospital policy and the way babies are treated, etc. Unfortunately, that's kind of the way it is these days. So in a hospital setting, Mark, you wouldn't have gotten the kind of attention that you would have ideally needed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really actually clued into a lot of this stuff in the last 12 or 15 years because this was pushed on us as nurses in the hospital, for people to say, hey, listen, it's really important to have touch time with babies, all these volunteers coming in to hold the babies, skin-to-skin contact. Yeah. I didn't really know about any of this, and then I saw that they had done enough studies and they'd seen enough problems with people, and they were relating a lot of it to you know, these famous infants coming out of Romania with all this neglect. And so that's when I really started to get a little more fascinated with it and look at it kind of a little more closely and say, yeah, obviously I do have attachment problems. I do have kind of like flat spots in my awareness for like, I think I've done overall, I think I've done remarkably well.
Yes.
But there are definitely like kind of like shaggy little corners of my psyche that are kind of brittle and easily wobbled. So,
Well, and what we know from the trauma lens is that anytime the nervous system is overwhelmed, and there really isn't a way out of that overwhelm, we move into states of dissociation where we just have to like turn off and check out. And it's natural. It's one of our body's main defense mechanisms when all else fails. I mean, and it does preserve the psychological integrity of someone who's going through things that are very, very difficult. You can survive those very, very difficult things without falling apart. And so the dissociation serves to ensure the survival of the person. But then what happens in the dissociation, especially if it's early, is that it does kind of create what Mark's talking about, these flat spots, or it's almost like areas that you don't have access to. They're not as accessible, and they are somewhat, we're blind to them in some ways. And so, I mean, Mark's really kind of exploring for himself and really explaining to all of you like the inside scoop really of what happens when things like this do happen to someone at a very early age. And a baby will have a very primitive nervous system, and so the babies develop their nervous systems in communion with capable adults. And so the capacity of the baby to withstand separations is it's minimal, you know, and that's why babies cry, you know. And it's like, you know, you hear a baby crying, it's like everybody in the room wants to figure out how to get the baby to stop crying and do whatever the baby needs, you know, and that's biological, it's evolutionary.
Now, my mom used to shake me.
That's not good.
I know, I'm not sorry.
Well, you're doing well. So I feel like, Mark, you really are kind of, you're explaining it so well. But, you know, this idea, like when we have these attachment disruptions, like sometimes people will just cut themselves off from other people. They won't attach to anyone. And then sometimes what happens is that they want to attach pretty readily, but there's a lot of anxiety around it, and so call it like an anxious attachment. Like I really need to connect, I need to connect, and there can be kind of like a lot of this like energy behind it that's very uncomfortable and doesn't quite feel stable. So people usually go in one of those directions, either just I don't want to have anything to do with attachment in people, or I really do want to have a lot to do with attachment in people, but it's like coming from this place that feels more anxiety prone.
yeah, I would say I fit both those pictures to a certain extent.
Yes, there is a combo.
Definitely certain times where I feel like it's just easier to kind of like hang back and I don't want to say isolate, but I think maybe in the last year and a half since a motorcycle accident, I've definitely isolated more. But yeah, that is a strategy. I have I would say, like everybody, attaching effectively to other people can be a challenge for me at times. And definitely there are times where I think I only know this in the last couple of months now, where if the attachment gets too intense, I just check out, you know. So there's a part of me that just says, okay, I'm out, and it's not even a conscious thing. It's just parts of me that sort of float around as free agents and just kind of do what, you know, they like the attachment, they like the continuity, but they're also ready to disappear if they need to. So.
Well, like when you check out or whatever, like, do you have memory lapse, or you just kind of go into a depression, or is it a different personality? Like, is it something you forget, or are you conscious? A lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like lately in the last couple of months, yeah, I would say I've been really, like, you know, dissociating. So I'll touch on kind of like a little bit of how this came about for me. Yep. That my motorcycle accident a year and a half ago just kind of rolled everything. And this is typical with people who are plurals. We call multiple personalities plurals, or you call them, you know, that people having alters. A lot of people don't like the word alters, but I tend to use plural more. But so my plurality kind of like was humming along with kind of a very kind of low-key presentation where, you know, I wouldn't even be aware of checking out at times, or I wouldn't even be aware that I was just going into kind of like those longer depressions with
but
you know, hollow feeling.
Your checkouts, like, do you have a memory lapse or anything, or is it like,
well, that's what I'm getting at, is that before I wouldn't really have much of that going on. It'd be subtle. But in the last year, I've been kind of like, because everything was really unstable for a lot of my days, there would be an afternoon where I'd be sitting on the couch, kind of just vegetating, maybe trying to read, or, you know, doing Facebook or whatever. And the next thing I know, I'd look out my door and it would be dark outside. So I started to figure out that I was losing time. Yeah. And those were hints.
Any effect, like driving, or like, has it happened to you? Like where
it's a kind of an interesting thing. It goes along with, like, these parts aren't stupid. They're not gonna like say, you know, oh, let me drive now. You know, they know that there's certain things that we're doing that involve a conscious effort. But for example, like, you know, steaks, New York strips are on special at Publix here. So I'll buy 3 of them for $16 when they're normally like 25 or something. And I'll come home, I'll cook a steak. I'll think, great, you know, I got 2 more steaks for the next couple of nights. But then I'll wake up the next morning and the frying pan will be dirty in the sink and the steaks will be gone. So at some point at 2, 3, 4 a.m., I got up and I cooked another couple of steaks, and I don't remember it, you know, and there's little things like this that have been happening more and more in the last like 2 or 3 months that are almost funny. Like they'll hide shit on me. I've got a 4-year-old who's nonverbal. Her name is Rocka, and she thinks it's fucking hilarious to hide stuff. So it's like what brothers and sisters would do with each other anyways. But there are things where, like, I'll look everywhere for something, and I won't recognize that the last place I put it down, like, I know I looked all over the table. It's not there. And then I go back and look at the table for the 5th time, and it's just like 6 inches over from where I left it. And so she plays with me like that sometimes. And I've been trying to get her to kind of chill out a little bit with that stuff, to say, hey, listen, like, you know, you can hide shit, but let me find it within like 15 minutes or something, because some of it's crazy. But this is them kind of trying to tell me, hey, I'm here, you know? And so this picture in your mind of yourself in your complete package gets disrupted, and it's not easy for your brain to accept that. your brain at first is like, no, that's not happening. That's my imagination, or that's, you know, like when this first started coming around for me in the fall, I was like, holy, you know, like I've got to be delusional here. I'm pretty sure this is my bipolar flaring up, and I've got a delusional picture that I've got different personalities. And then there was other parts of me that were like, no, you can't, you know, hide something from yourself for 2 hours and then have it all of a sudden show up again.
Lloyd's just coming to get butter tarts.
Oh.
And he's escaping.
So how much of the like time during your day does this affect, like in terms of like if you're losing things, or like how much time during your day do you think that you lose?
I think what the sense that I'm getting on this is a lot of it has to do with my state of calm.
Yeah.
And how operational I need to be. So if I'm fairly calm and I'm in a kind of a zone where I'm getting a lot of stuff done, which has been like almost impossible for the last 18 months.
Yeah.
But lately I'm starting to find that I can kind of like get everybody on the same page. And if everybody's floating at the same level, I can be like somewhat effective through my day. But there are still things that kind of rattle us, and all of a sudden, you know, someone's going the other way. So that flip out at times will rob me of a half an hour of my day on average. I might, you know, I've blown 20 minutes looking for my phone because I don't know where I set it down, but it's been in my hand the whole time. Where it's just I'll get into some of the structure of it for you in a bit, but I would say right now at the stage I'm at, where I'm just figuring this stuff out and just waking up to it, you know, there's at least a couple hours of my day that are not very productive because I'm just kind of like wobbling around with trying to see what's going on. And then there are times, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just saying, you know, maybe it's fair to say that you're still discovering, you know, what triggers it to become dissociative. And when you become dissociative, sometimes it's hard to recognize because it's something that's been a part of you for a very long time as well. So is it fair to say that's still in the self-discovery part? Or do you feel like you've recognized certain triggers already?
Well, I think triggers are an important thing to recognize. And when you can kind of manage your triggers, you can probably manage 70% of this. But what I already have going on that I think is rare for certain people who are just starting out with this is called co-consciousness. So it's like where parts are aware of each other and they can kind of like process things together. And then sometimes they dissociate. And once they dissociate and they're split apart, then they're not aware of each other anymore. So it's hard for me to give you like exact numbers or exact scenarios where we're dissociating because, you know, there may be 30 minutes a day that I'm doing something that I'm not even aware I'm doing. One of the things is rocking. If you've been watching Facebook, you've seen my hammock. The littles love the hammock. They're like, yeah, let's get in the hammock and just swing for a while. So, but I'll wake up sometimes and I'll be kind of like crouching over with my face in the pillow and my ass in the air, and I'll be rocking. And I don't even like, I was kind of like shocked the first couple of times I woke up like this, and I'm like, okay, I guess that's Rocka. And it's, you know, kind of a more of a typical thing you'd see an autistic child doing, or a child with some sort of developmental delays doing. And, you know, all, like all of this stuff for me, becoming a nurse has been kind of a silver lining, in that I'm able to recognize stuff in a clinical way or in a somewhat professional way that maybe most people wouldn't see. But it's also kind of funny. I should mention that I just was drawn to nursing. You know, like this kid starting out and you know, pick me up, wanting all these nurses to be around them, and then years later, you know, just getting into nursing and thinking it was great. So I kind of find that heartwarming in a way, to say it's kind of like you go back and you resolve your issues, or you go back and you try to pick up the pieces that didn't quite fit together in the beginning. So that's kind of been my thing.
It's really moving, Mark.
Somebody else say something.
Oh,
Well, I guess I have a follow-up, would be, what do you feel your family can do to best support you?
I'm not sure. A big part of the reason I'm going full guns with outing myself with this is because I've been writing about it for so long. You know, I've had a book that I've been working on for 7 years. People are sick of hearing about it because it's like, oh yeah, that book you're going to put out, right. But when I got divorced 8 years ago, that was a huge break in attachment for me, and that was another trauma that kind of spun everything around. And so we started writing about it. And I thought I was a guy with a chameleon personality with attachment issues that could kind of like change his style to kind of like meet other people where they were, to blend with them in a way that successfully attached. So that I was writing as a multiple personality because I was a, you know, kind of like a cousin to multiple personalities already. But now that I realize that, no, that was actually Patience. That was like my main alter, my main partner is Patience. And she was writing, she's the more creative one than Mark. She was writing the story to try to tell me what was going on. So I'm just like, from my family, asking for, you know, your attention, and like, for some of you guys, I know that there's going to be kind of like this, okay, hold it, this is too weird, I'm out. That, you know, you got multiple personalities, see you later, but nice knowing you. I'm okay with that. Like, but because I'm going to start writing and I'm going to start putting this stuff out there in the public arena, I'm trying to give you all kind of like at least the basics on what's going on with me before you just read about it somewhere, you know. So part of it is courtesy. Part of it is finally understanding a lot of my pieces, a lot of the ways that I work, and really like kind of celebrating that I've made it this far. Like, it's kind of amazing to me that I have, and that a big part of it was being so wonderfully placed in such a great, loving family. You know, I was so lucky, so really lucky to be adopted.
Mm.
and now that you know, like, so what's the prognosis? Like, you're going to be, because I don't really find a big difference. Like, you know, like, we've always had the same relationship. We've gone through all kinds of crazy shit we don't have to talk about, but like, I find you're still the same guy, you know. Like, I've never seen any difference, like, you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, like, am I gonna see that, like, or like, are you on just a really good behavioral point right now, and like, you know, like are you gonna just mellow out? Like, I don't know what's gonna happen. Like, it's like, does it get better? Does it get worse? Like, I guess we don't know, right?
Yeah, I don't really know as far as like what the year-to-year thing will be with this. There are people who have a real they're very geared to being integrated. And what that means is they get everybody lined up, and now, okay, we're just going to be one person. And the problem with this, and if you read enough about it, I won't get into too much of it, is that, you know, some people just can't do it. They stay fragmented their whole life. And I'm 55. So for me to work for the next 5 or 10 years to try to get integrated, I mean, I don't really see too much of a point. It's not like I have 20 personalities. At least I don't think I do now. I should also say that in the beginning, sometimes you figure out like one layer of your family, and then, you know, as time goes on, there's other people that crop out. So I don't really know. I think I'm a pretty small system right now, but I don't think it's a big deal to have the system I have right now running. Rocka is 4. She's nonverbal. Spyder, if Sara remembers, Sara asked me for some notes for me to keep a journal while I was fasting in November. And that's when I met Spyder. Spyder came out and was like, you know, he didn't really say anything, but the intuitive sense I got was, here's this little entity that's kind of popped out and saying, look, buddy, the only fucking thing I live for is to eat, and you're fasting. This is day 13. You know, what the fuck are you doing? So that's when I really kind of knew. I was like, holy shit, this little being just kind of like asserted itself inside of me. And Spyder's the 2-month-old. It's hard to put a perfect age on these guys, but the sense I have is he's somewhere around 2 months. He's absorbed all the pain. He kind of like holds himself together by you know, clenching and staying tight. And then Lulu is the one who's about 4 months of age, and she is the happy baby, the one that gives you the eyes and kind of like engages you and draws you in. And those two, kind of like the male, the female, if you want to get into a philosophical picture of it, kind of did the split and figured stuff out while we were at that infant stage. Rocka, Spyder, and Lulu are all nonverbal. There's a way to get your parts talking to you, your littles. These small children are called littles. So if you want to get your littles talking to you, you can do it. You can kind of train them. But I'm not even sure I want to train them, because basically it's Patience, who's 12, and Mark, who's 9, who are kind of like running the show. And they've been doing it fairly successfully for all these years. So if I just leave the system kind of like in the basic form that it's at, I think I can just cruise with it. Now, I could be full of shit. This could all kind of like, you know, expand out and become, you know, 5 other people popping out in the next year, and all kinds of animosity or cross purposes happening, and it could be really stressful. But the thing with me is, most of my situation comes from neglect. So the neglect itself is traumatic, but it wasn't like, you know, at least from what I can tell, at least from how I know things at this point, it wasn't like any kind of high-end sexual abuse where I was like really, really cracked and broken continuously. And then the fact that I was adopted into such a loving family kind of half healed me as I was growing. And so I think I'm kind of a hybrid. I'm kind of a half-healed dissociative already. Like, I've already managed to come out fairly cleanly with this without being kind of like, there are dissociative people who never tell their family. They hide for the rest of their life. Like, they know their DID, but they don't really advertise it or anything like that. So for me, it's like, if I can manage it the way I'm managing it now and do okay, it should be fine. Like, at certain points, you might see Patience come out. Like, she's very playful. She did that Facebook video about Groundhog Day back at the beginning of the month. So, but she's probably not going to come out in a meeting like this. What you're seeing right now is Ryder, and Ryder is the adult straight guy. And that's a combination of Mark and Patience together. Mark at 9, Patience at 12, deciding that they're gonna like, okay, we can be an adult if we stick together and have this co-consciousness. So that co-consciousness has kind of got us along. And then on the other side, there's Ridicu, there's the crazy guy who all of you know pretty well, who is like everybody. It's just a free-for-all in there, and everybody's doing whatever the hell they want, and all kinds of goofy shit happens. But he knows that he has to kind of like fold back and let Ryder come around and do the adult stuff when it's required. So there's already this agreement of how we operate. Like, we already know instinctively that there are times where we can be crazy and outrageous, and sometimes that happens a little too much, and you know, we wind up in jail, whatever. But most of the time we understand that we can hold to a sort of a typical straight line. So when you say, is there a prognosis, I'm kind of feeling like I'm sort of, I discovered this stuff, but I'm already kind of half healed from it.
Yeah.
And with Kat, and on my own with meditation and different mindfulness, I've done a lot of healing work already around the attachment, broken attachment. I've done a lot of healing work around this constantly feeling vulnerable to, like, you know, hollowness and crappy energy. So I don't, you know, you can watch some YouTube videos where you'll see somebody come out in like 12 different personalities, and they'll talk like little girls, little boys, you know, teenagers, old people, and they're like 27 years old. And so I don't see myself ever being in that kind of picture. I just don't have the elaborate, broken, multi personas system that some people have. And some people with this stuff, like as far as I'm concerned, if you can manage all of those, you're playing in the NBA. Like, you're like some kind of a very heightened, very multifaceted being. And I've discovered some of that a little bit for myself, the way I am. But I'm thankful that I'm also kind of like more down to earth about it, and it's not as fragmented for me. Like, I feel fortunate that I'm diagnosed and that I've got this picture now that I can see what's going on, but it's not so, you know, like dozens of personalities to contend with. I'm pretty fortunate.
Mark, do you want to tell everyone about the work that you're doing with the trauma?
Yeah, it's all really preliminary stuff right now. I have a picture of probably staying with the system and just managing the way I am. And to tell you the truth, it's kind of fun having these parts of myself that are like a family, like a built-in family. So I don't see that it's really necessary to integrate. The program that I'm in, its main focus is to integrate people. So if you go and look out there in the psychology world, you'll find, like, you know, half or more of major programs have a goal of integration. And it's right in the wording of this program. It's the TRIP program, Trauma Resolution Integration Program. So I don't know how much of this stuff I'm going to carry on with. I'm going to go into it and kind of like learn a lot of strategies, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be doing a lot of the integration work. And I've still got to figure that out. I've still got to get, like, my psychologist that I had years ago. I had her for 6 years. She looked at my early attachment stuff and she said, you know, if you get into that, you can spend the rest of your life trying to figure that out. Why don't you leave it alone? So I thought about it, and I was like, yeah, you're probably right. You know, like, I mean, you can get bogged down in, oh, what happened to me when I was a baby and stuff. But that was years ago when the focus really wasn't on trauma. Like in the last 5 or 10 years, we've learned so much about trauma and how it affects the system that, you know, her advice back then was a little iffy. For me now to look at it and say, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to resolve all of these little fine points of trauma so I can be integrated is, I'm not sure I'm really interested in doing that.
That's a lot of work, eh? Like in time, and like you gotta,
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you think Mussolini affected you too? I bet you like, because you were picked on by a lot of the kids and you were the only white kid and stuff like that. You were pretty young. Like, was it rough there? You remember it being rough at Mussolini?
Oh, yeah. The thing about me all my life is I've always been able to kind of like drop into this isolation picture,
Yeah.
like alone. And, you know, even when I'm around loving people and stuff, I can still feel alone. It's just part of that internal wiring in my system. But living in Moosonee when I was, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, 8 years old in Moosonee. For those of you who don't know, Moosonee is this little native community on the bottom of James Bay in northern Canada. And it's like 80% native. So
Very remote.
yeah. So I would get the shit kicked out of me after school all the time. Like it would be like, okay, we're going to beat up the white kid today. And it was just kind of like not unexpected for me. It was kind of you know, this is where I'm at and I just have to figure my way through it. So, you know, eventually I stopped running. I stopped being scared. They'd come up to me and look at me like they were going to, you know, lay a beating on me, and I just look at them. And one day, one of the bigger native kids goes, you know what? This guy's brave. We're going to leave him.
Oh, but I remember like you talked to me about a lot when you were a kid too. It was rough, you know. It was a rough place to grow up for, you know, only child and shit like that. But,
yeah. Yeah, I figured out once a native kid stopped beating up on me regularly, if you didn't run out of the schoolhouse for home and you walked with everybody else, all the white kids walked in a pack down the sidewalk together and they dropped each other off at their houses. Only child, right? Like you don't even think of that stuff. You're like, oh, this makes sense.
And that's back in the day when bullying was okay. It was acceptable in society. Let's bully the white kid, you know.
Yeah, there was a lot of
And
haze.
bullying can cause disassociation as well.
Absolutely.
Sorry, what's it? Bullying? Oh yeah.
Very traumatizing.
I look at bullying today, and I think that people don't realize that you know, it's probably not just in the form of schoolyard bullying, but in the whole picture of the whole tableau of our lives. Yeah. It's probably the number one thing holding us back is that we're willing to, you know, in any little way take advantage and dominate another person. It's just so undermining of the spirit and the genuineness that's available to people if they just accept each other and try to support and lift people up. When you get into bullying, you're just kind of like breaking everything down and tearing things apart and fragmenting society. I don't mean to sound like I'm on a soapbox here, but yeah, it's just a crazy way to kind of like keep ourselves separated and in shambles.
I didn't even think of Moosonee, you know, and how that would have affected you.
No, I don't. I was thinking about you for the last few days, just thinking about all the stuff, and a lot of stuff you know, we went through personally too, in Vancouver and stuff. Sometimes I think you think it was going on back then because you had a few characters too, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think.
Our 20s. That was. It
Yeah,
wasn't,
yeah. Well, I remember trashing that apartment we lived in there the one time. I can't remember the circumstances, but the next morning you looked at me and you said, "Oh, the Indian really came out in you last night." And I was,
Our family's Métis, you know, like the one he was adopted into. It wasn't that bad. It was bad. I should have said the Aboriginal.
right.
Or no, what is it? Indigenous come out in me. And that's wrong too. It's all wrong.
Yeah, we're all brothers and sisters. It's funny to look at the distinctions that are made today for native rights and Aboriginal claims to lands and stuff. I look at it and I go, they're totally right. It's just that they're applying. It's kind of like saying you'd like your car waxed by an electrician. The electrician's just going to shock you with electricity. So when the Aboriginals are asking the government for Aboriginal rights, it's like they're just asking the wrong people. The people have to recognize, I think, that this is valid stuff. I mean, I'm not going to get into too much politics here. I'm just saying it's kind of a weird thing. Growing up in it the way I did, there was these church basements at the church in Moosonee where they'd collect all the kids on Saturday for matinees. And these priests were brilliant, They'd have like 7 or 8 white kids sitting in the front row with about 40 or 50 native kids sitting all around them. And what would they show us for Saturday matinees? Cowboy and Indian movies.
Jesus.
We're all sitting there going, "Oh, thanks, man. This is great.
It's gonna be fun in the it's fun in the yard."
Yeah.
Well, it's becoming a better world, I think, Mark.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of openings that we're seeing that are new, and communications that are happening that are bringing things around for us. Like Kat has been very activism minded for so long around feminist rights, and that all ties in very nicely with my nursing awareness too. Like if I could give any guy out there a profession for 2 years that they had to go and do religiously, it would be nursing, because you see things from the female perspective so clearly when you're a nurse. And so yeah, there's a lot of different stuff.
Does anyone have any more questions for Mark about the dissociative identity disorder, or just anything else going on in his life right now? Or any, Mark, is there anything you feel like you really want to say too while we have this?
Is there anything that we should be careful about? Is there
Good question.
is there any level of sensitivity, or is there do's and, I mean, besides being polite and human, but the obvious, but is there triggers that we should avoid, or is there anything like that, or just normal with your life?
Well, patience, and for those of you who have done some of the reading on the blog that I'd had there for a while, and you'll see the book eventually, it's much more polished, but patience has had to run things on the inside for 50 years, and she can be, to put it bluntly, a bitch. If she's unhappy, she has no problem letting you know. So if you ever get a late night call, like if you say something to me one afternoon and it's you get a late night call a few hours later, and it sounds just like me when she's talking to you, and she says, "Look," that's a possibility. Like she's ripped a strip off of a few people coming out, and part of that is the trauma. Like what you have to understand is she's been hiding her whole life, And now when she's out, she feels this paranoia, this exposure, this, you know, she remembers the trauma. She, you know, the littles remember the trauma. They're all hypersensitive to, okay, we're out, so we have to protect ourselves. So she's in like hyper protection mode. It's not like Patience doesn't love you guys. Like she's here with me right now talking as Ryder. She's here. Mark and Patience are together right now. But if she gets, you know, freaked out or feels threatened, she can come out and just be a fucking royal prick, like any of us can. Like any of us feeling wronged in some situation can come out with this other side of ourselves and just kind of like terrorize everybody. So, you know, there are times where there have been times recently in the last couple of months where she's kind of just gone off the hook, and I'm standing back on. I don't know if any of you remember my old grandmother, my dad's mother, Lottie. Her name was Charlotte, but we called her Lottie.
Yeah.
Remember her? Everybody thought she was great, the nice little British old lady. Holy fuck. I mean, just wow.
Oh, yeah.
And Patience.
It was good.
Yeah, oh, yeah, it was funny.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So Patience will tell you, like she's told Mom, she goes, look, you don't know who you're dealing with here right now. I'm Lottie. And Bernard, my dad's father, and Lottie, my dad's mother, babysat us quite a bit in the beginning when we were 2 and 3 years old. So I think that, you know, a lot of that sort of British strictness, that harsh. I don't really, as Mark, remember much of it. But whenever you see me come out and I'm sharp and the fangs are out and it's just like you're gonna get a fucking strip ripped off of you, that's Patience, that's the Lottie, that's that kind of abusive trauma that kind of gets reflected. Now, of course, the goal is to simmer that down and behave a little more smoothly and a little, you know, better in society and everything. But it's a thing, it's a part of me, and I know it's probably going to be a part of her for a long, long time. So you have to recognize where it's coming from, though. It's the trauma. It's mainly when you feel vulnerable and your back's against the wall and you need to lash out at people, it's because your back's against the wall. It's because you don't feel like you have any other choice. And I would ask you to remember, basically, she's 12 years old. She's like been fighting to kind of like manage things. It would be like someone managing the entire river around them by only standing on one rock in the middle of the river. So she's had very little purchase, but she's had to try to manage everything in as broad a fashion as possible on the inside. So she's, you know, challenged. She doesn't mind coming out and hitting it hard when she has to. So not the way she likes to perform. It's not the way she chooses to be, but at times that's the way it is. So
how do you know all these characters that you have, that, you know, you have like a young and then you have older and then you have, how does that all work in your head? Like it's hard to understand it.
Well, the thing that's been happening to me for the year and a half that I've been scrambled, let's say use the word scrambled by that motorcycle accident a year and a half ago, is that I've got this pinched nerve in my neck. I had 5 broken ribs in 7 places. I had a broken shoulder, broken collarbone. So I don't sleep very well. 2 or 3 hours has been my average. And what I've been finding in the last couple of months since sorting some of this out, I've been getting maybe 3 or 4. But what's been going on as well is that I've discovered that I lucid dream. So in other words, I'm awake, but I'm dreaming. It's kind of like a weird, I don't even understand that much about it. I was reading a little bit about it a couple of months ago, and I said, you know what? I'm going to put this aside and figure it out later, because it's a little too esoteric for me in everything I got going on in my head right now to figure out what that lucid dreaming is all about. But when I was 13 years old, I sat bolt upright in bed, and I had terrible nightmares as a kid, all growing up. Like I wake up sweating, and I said, "That's it. I am not going to remember any more of my dreams." And from that moment on, I haven't really remembered much more than a couple of dozen dream fragments all my life. Like, you know, waking up in the morning and just having a little dream piece floating around in your head, and you lose it within 5 minutes of waking up. But what I do now is I'll even know, I've even started to recognize it now, where I'll be up walking around in the apartment. I'll go outside. I'll take my hammock. I'll hang it on the poles outside. I'll hop in the hammock for half an hour at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm laying there and I'm looking at the moonlight, and I'm kind of asleep. Like I'm not in an awake state. I'm operating at a different level. It's kind of like maybe I'm dissociated and I'm the littles, or I'm lucid dreaming. I'm not exactly 100% sure, but I'll find things out at that point. Like I'll understand things. And there have been times where I've been triggered all my life by certain things that make me really tense. And in the last, I would say it was probably December, where a couple of triggers that have been like dogging me my whole life finally got explained to me. And when they were explained in that dream state, I was like, oh, well, that fucking totally makes sense. And now I don't have that trigger anymore. So it's kind of like I describe it to people like you get a telegram. You don't know, it's not a piece of paper with anything written out on it, but it's almost that sensation of you're sitting there, you're floating along, things are fine, but then all of a sudden there's this awareness, and boom, it's just as plain as day written in front of you on a telegram. This is what's going on. And so, you know, figuring out Rocka, figuring out Lulu and Spyder, it kind of came to me in a dream state, but it's very, very plain, and it like makes a ton of sense. It's kind of like that stuff that you have going on in your life that is in the back of your head that you never really understand. And then one day, all of a sudden, you turn around and you see it, and you're like, "Holy shit! Now I understand." It's like that. It's very affirming, and when you know it, you can't unknow it. It's not like something you just made up in your head. You know, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it.
Wild stuff, eh?
Oh.
No, I just said it's wild stuff. Like it's a lot to take in, you know. Like it's.
I just got what you said. Well, you know, what Mark's talking about to some degree is pretty typical for everybody, in the sense that, I mean, there's a number of different schools of psychology and healing that talk about different personalities that live inside of us, and people work with that therapeutically. So they don't have DID, for instance, but they can identify that there might be like a really young part of themselves that gets upset when certain things happen, or there's an inner critic that comes in, can be very punitive and say mean things. And, you know, there can be like an inner mother and an inner father. And, you know, they talk about, you know, some people being able to identify up to 80 different subpersonalities, you know, without having any kind of dissociation that goes along with them. And part of the therapy is working with the different subpersonalities, especially, for instance, if you have like a very strong inner critic that developed at a certain point for whatever reason. And sometimes, you know, the critic can be the one that's driving the bus and of one's life, and your life reflects that. And so in the therapy, you'll work with the inner critic, and the inner critic will have a new place on the bus that's not driving the bus, for instance. Some people have these like very young parts of themselves driving their bus in their lives, and that young part of themselves makes very poor decisions in relationship and otherwise. And so part of the therapy is bringing bringing the adult self on board fully so that the adult self is driving the bus and the little ones are in the back. And, this has like been common practice in therapeutic circles for decades. And, Mark has a much more advanced kind of differentiation between these personalities and some dissociation that goes along with them as well. And that's different from what I'm talking about just in kind of like normal course of therapy. But my point is that we all have a cast of characters inside of us, whether we ever get in touch with them or not, they exist. And that whole idea has been known for many decades at this point. I mean, since the 60s at least, and probably even before that in indigenous cultures, So Mark's talking about something different, but he's also talking about something that is human.
So just out of curiosity, like what kind of exercises do you do to sort of manage that?
Can you say that again? I got a little bit of background noise.
Just out of curiosity, you were saying that you were doing exercises to, for example, bring out the adult as opposed to the child. Like what sort of exercises do you do?
Well, part of it involves, it's so there's a process of identifying the different subpersonalities. So someone will say something in therapy like, it's hard for me to come up with a sort of like extemporaneously, but they'll say something, and then like as a therapist, you'll say, kind of like, that's interesting that you say that. If you feel into it, about what age do you feel like you are when you say that? And so you start kind of like calling out, like, and they'll be like, oh, I feel like I'm like 7 or 8, and you're like, okay, so you're 7 or 8. Does this part of you look like anything in particular? And so you can kind of like, people will say, oh, looks like a little dog, or I mean, they'll come up with something there, and then you'll start to basically like if you were the director in a play, you start kind of identifying this character, like how they are, how they respond to certain situations, what are the things that they say, because sometimes like even if you're not trying to learn about your subpersonalities, there's certain kind of thoughts that go through your head all the time, like you've had that thought hundreds of times and you're not really sure where it comes from, but sometimes it's like a different part of ourself that's coming, that's having that thought. And so you start identifying the subpersonality, and then what you do is you consciously like bring in, if you're an adult and you're not working with a child, you bring in your adult self. And most people can do that. They can be like, oh, that little one subpersonality is not my adult self. So they can differentiate between the two. Like, this is not the adult. The adult would be like this. And so then you put the adult in relationship to that younger self. And so those two start having a conversation. So mostly what has to happen is that you have to, in the therapy, realize that you are not the young self in this example, that's not you entirely. You're the adult self. The young self is there, but the adult self is the one that needs to be in charge. And so you start doing a process called differentiation. You differentiate from that young part that it basically is trying to drive the bus and shouldn't be driving the bus. And so you have to say, no, I'm here now. I'm going to drive the bus and you're going to get in the back. And there's typically like a relaxation in the system, the person when that happens, because they realize the kid can't drive the bus and like has been very stressed trying to drive the bus and very happy for some adult to come along and do the adult things. But this goes on. I mean, this is like on, many therapy sessions, like whole systems of therapy. There's something called internal family systems, IFS, which does all this stuff. I mean, there's something called family constellations where you'll be in a group and that you'll actually have people play out these different personalities within inside of you. So someone becomes your young self, and then someone else becomes your adult self, and like they go through a whole dramatic reenactment of what goes on inside of you. I mean, it makes therapy just sound absolutely nuts, but this is something that is really helpful for people and very healing for them to kind of realize, like, oh, that's not me. This is me, really, the adult self, and these are all different parts of myself that I can be in relationship with, but don't need to be in charge. Does that probably overshot your question, but does that clarify anything for you? Yeah. Okay.
I think it's important to understand some of the motivations sometimes, and if you're operating with lower, I don't like to say like younger people in your system might be less capable, because there are certain needs that they have that are very pure and very admirable. But like,
well,
there was a stretch over Christmas where all I was eating was those round truffles from Lindor, because I'd been starving Spyder like through November. When I finally figured out that he was just a little guy that all he liked to do was eat, we just ate, Christ, I don't know, probably 10 times the amount of chocolate at Christmas time that I've ever eaten before in my life, because I was like, okay, we'll be fat if you want to eat chocolate. But that wasn't, that's not a good ongoing thing to operate with. You want to be able to say, and it's funny, after a while, he got the idea that, okay, I can eat what I want. So he's calmed down about it now. And I think we're eating better. We're actually making healthier choices, because he recognizes that, it's not, he doesn't feel compromised when we eat healthy. He knows he's still being looked after. It's kind of weird.
But this is part of your management strategy, Mark, like the rocking and the hammock, and there's things that you're doing very consciously to appease and make sure these different parts of you are comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like I'm back at work nursing a bunch of babies again. Like I'm kind of like looking after kids. It's actually pretty easy for me to do. It's like, oh, you need this? Okay, let me get it. This is kind of why I think I've progressed so nicely into this, and I'm able to be pretty open about it, because it doesn't seem like it's so unmanageable to me. Where some guys in their 50s figuring out that they've got a 12-year-old girl inside of them would be freaking out. I'm like, okay, yeah. We actually wrote about her in the book. We said we have this internal 12-year-old lesbian who won't talk to us. And it was kind of a funny thing at the time to think, yeah, I do feel like I've got an internal lesbian. I've always said I was a lesbian trapped in a man's body. And we love women. So it's like just kind of like a funny thing. But the fact that there's this person that won't talk to us, it just makes it more like discreet, in that she was talking to us. She just wasn't talking to us in a way that we really kind of could grasp, could understand. So now that we're understanding it, we're trying to look after each other much, much better. It's kind of a cool thing, actually. And yeah, if that question is hanging.
I love that. We just.
I think I'm going to stay with the enjoying women for the rest of this lifetime in this meat.
Let's see what Spyder has to say. He's got to grow up, Mark. You never know. And it's all okay.
Well, I think coming out with it and is good for you. It's good for, like we all have inner children, child, and it's just dealing with it. And obviously that's what your trauma has surfaced all these past things that have happened to you in your life, and now you're just learning to, it's a coping mechanism.
We all have like the inner voices, but I think for some of us, they're louder than for others. Like, you know, like I know, like I have similar traits, like listening to what you're saying. I have the repeats in my head where, you know, like I'm criticizing myself. I'm my father giving me shit, like, you know, like for whatever it is. But I think it's different, but the same, right? You know what I mean? Like it's.
Yeah.
Right. The difference with Mark is that there's a dissociative quality. So he could be in one and not know that the others are there, and not remember being there either. Whereas like kind of the more kind of would say like average, normal, for lack of a better word, spectrum is like
You're always there. Yeah.
You're still there always.
Yeah.
You will remember what has happened. You don't have like large gaps in your memory typically, unless the dissociation is there. And obviously the dissociative identity disorder is due to a kind of a overwhelming trauma.
Yeah.
But I do believe that we are all traumatized in some way or another. Some people more so, some people less so, but I think we all carry trauma of some kind.
Yeah.
Nature, you like to live, you have to be scared or traumatized somehow, or you would have never, you know, like something has to happen, right?
Everybody's been through something.
Yeah.
Often more than just something. So, yeah. What were you going to say?
One of the things that I've come to say about this is, you know, people think that like dissociation can look like a mental illness, because if your parts are at odds, if they're fighting, or if they're in different levels of awareness, you're saying one thing here and a total different thing here. People are like, holy crap, you know, you're mentally ill. But if you're aligned, if you've got some sort of agreement going on and things are moving in a good direction, you're fairly okay. So the way I describe it, and the way I went to a conference a couple of weeks ago, and these kids in their 20s were all kind of hanging out and educating me and a couple of the other people in the room that were new to it, that it can look like a mental illness, but really it's a neurobiological coping mechanism. So where you get some people who are biting their nails, let's say, to cope, or to as a nervous tick to kind of like soothe themselves somehow. You get people who are tearing off parts of their personality and stashing them in places, you know, tearing away something that's pristine and needs to be protected and shifting it over here. So it's just a different way of masking or veiling things so that they're protected. And
survival strategy.
Yeah, it's a great strategy. It just when it's time to kind of like figure it out, it looks a little messy. It's like, holy crap, what's going on with this guy?
Mm.
And I don't know what's going on with me all the time. I'm okay with that. I mean, it's just who I am, you know. It's like I'm not necessarily, you know, I'm not the guy you want recording the event because I might have like 4 different ideas about it, which is great for being a writer, but it's not so great for being an accountant or something.
Someone of stability. A pillar of our community is what. But that's all good too.
Mark, I do think we want to begin wrapping up a bit. So
Yeah, we're getting time there.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know if Hilary's still on the call. Are you still there, Hill?
Yep, I'm still here.
Do you want to say anything else?
Just that we love you and care for you, and I think you've been very courageous in sharing everything that's going on for you, and you do know yourself best. So I think, like you said, you've made it this far, and I think you're going to continue to grow and to expand, and I'm very proud of you.
yeah, thank you.
I couldn't understand that.
Me too.
I don't know if it was just my computer, but did you hear anything?
I understood, Hilary, that you were saying that just expressing your love and care and support and being really proud of Mark for being courageous and doing what he's doing right now, and maybe there's something else too that I missed, but I felt like that was a general gist of what you were saying, but feel free to add to that.
No, that was essentially it. Sorry, I didn't have myself on speaker.
Oh,
That's better.
That's much better.
A lot
Yeah.
better now.
Connection was dying or something. I was like, oh, God.
Okay.
yeah.
I meant to say I didn't hear it. Not that I didn't understand it, because I couldn't hear it. But yes, I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, I really appreciate how supportive everyone has been on this in this meeting with Mark. Just sitting here from the outside perspective, I feel like it's really beautiful and lovely that, Mark, you have all of these amazing family members that are really here for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You guys have been great for a long, long time.
Oh, you're an easy guy to love, Mark.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now we just got more. Yay.
More.
More of him to love.
We'll have fun here still, Brett.
Yeah.
Definitely not in Florida. I think bad things would happen. Maybe out here in the country, where the law's far away. It's reasonably safe. I don't have guns or anything anymore, so that's all good. Just a peaceful, nice farm weekend,
Right. Yeah. Down here would wind up in the Everglades in some kind of a wildlife incident or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, last visit was nice. It was just bonfires and nice and quiet. Never got in no trouble, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we can behave yourself on your little stretch of land there.
Yeah, it's easier.
Well,
All right, well, I think Kat is probably at her time or maybe even a little over it.
Yes, I'm just gonna stop the recording now, if that's all right with everybody.
Sure.
Stop recording.